Aloha. And this is our first meeting in 1958. The last, I think, was November, wasn't it? And this will probably... No, we're apt to have another one in March before we leave on the next big trip. When we get back from Australia, we may be able to squeeze in a day over here. Be terrible if we didn't, wouldn't it? Would for us. Would for us. Home is where the heart is. As you know, we do not measure the progress of the infinite way unfoldment by numbers, by how many people read or come to this teaching of the infinite way, but rather by the effect of the infinite way on the lives of the individuals who do open themselves to it. In other words, our work is aimed at a definite result in the lives of the students. Our aim is not in how many students turn to it, since the matter of amount, degree of its spread, really will come from its effect on the lives of individuals. Now, when you stop to think that the monthly letter goes into about 5,000 homes, you use that 5,000 as your unit of watching the activity of the infinite way, rather than in the tens of thousands who purchase books or hear lectures around the world, because you can tell better by the lives of those in the 5,000 homes who are making a serious enough study of the work to have the letter come to them, to know what is happening. And so the first thing that I would like to tell you is this, that after that Asian flu epidemic of last year, on checking with our practitioners all over, we found that they all had the same experience that I did. They did not have a single call for help for flu in any community where our students operate. In other words, none of those 5,000 homes was touched with Asian flu, or if it was touched at all, it was handled by those in the home rather than having to reach out for any further help. That is one specific way of knowing what takes place where this spiritual influence is. Another way is the measurement of my own mail. My mail last year, 1957, from the homes where the letters go, was far less for spiritual help than in any year I've ever known. My mail itself increased, but that was by the increase of mail from the homes where the infinite way is just coming into expression. But my mail was far less from the active students of the infinite way than anything I have ever known. Now, all of this too indicates evidently a lessening degree of either illness or lack or unhappiness, misfortune. And it is in this manner that we are able to see whether or not the study and practice of the infinite way is changing our lives. Now, in the days of the Master, they taught spiritual principles by using the ordinary ways of life as illustrations. They used the examples of farming and so forth. They used the examples of their everyday experiences and built around them the spiritual lessons. Today, with machinery doing most of that work, we can't use those examples as they did. But we have a wider experience on which to build ours, and that is world affairs, because we happen to be in that particular period of history where world affairs occupies the major attention of the world. We can almost base our individual experiences by our relationship to these world affairs. An official of the British government was over here recently, making a tour of the United States, speaking to those high in office and evidently in touch with the press and radio. And when he went back to England, he said, America is an unbelievable land. It is living in a world of fear, such as is unknown anywhere else on earth. He says that there is almost a cloud of fear in which the people live. And he says the things that they fear sometimes frighten you and sometimes amuse you. And then he said, of course, their main fear is that they will be exterminated by a bomb. Now, of course, in your travels around the rest of the world, you don't meet with that fear. I told you, I guess a year or two ago, that was one of the strange things that you notice when you leave this country. You don't meet up with that fear of the bomb until you get back into it again. It may be because they've had so much bombing that they don't believe anything could be anything worse than they've had, since what can be worse than being bombed? And if you've been bombed, well, that's it. You either survived it or you didn't. Those that didn't have nothing left to fear. Those that do realize that it was foolish to fear. They're still here. But for whatever reason, he brought the attention of the press in England to the fact of this tremendous fear that grips the people. And then he went on and told many other things that they fear. And from our television, he took the idea that they fear body odors for fear they lose their husbands or wives if they should happen to have one. And a few other choice items like that from the television. And he built up quite a story of these fears. Of course, he was exaggerating, but he was bringing to light the state of national consciousness. And as you work in a work like ours, you do realize the amount of fear that grips so many of the people as they first come to a spiritual study. And then you notice how much less of that you find in your own groups, how much talk of the bombs and how little talk of the bombs and how little talk of the fears of the world that you come in contact with. And of course, as you meet with people of the outside world, they give you the impression that you are, or we are, hiding from the world and living an escape by not fearing it, until you do remind them that the hero dies but once and the coward dies every day of the week. A normal person probably does die once, but certainly there should be no reason for dying every single day of the week from the fear of a bomb or the fear of disease or the fear of this, that, or the other thing. And the point that I would like to make to you is this: that fear and living in fear is inevitable to a world that is living primarily from the standpoint of preserving either their health, their body, or their particular form of wealth. Anything that endangers a person's livelihood brings fear. Anything that endangers a person's heart or lungs brings fear. Anything that endangers a person's human sense of life brings fear, and that is inevitable when these have become the gods of one's world. If the object of life is to live 10 years longer or to have less pain, if the object of life is just to be sure that enough supply comes in every week to take care of the situation, then of course anything that would interfere with those things would result in fear. In my experience in this work, I have learned that fear is behind most of the troubles of those who seek help. You must remember that only a few people seek spiritual teachings for the purpose of living spiritual lives or finding God. Very few. The vast majority of those who come to work such as ours are coming because of a need for greater health or greater supply or greater human relationships, better human relationships, for peace, safety, security. And so it is easy to follow and to see how fear develops when these lacks become evident in one's experience. Then the first thing you notice is that you must, in some way, overcome the fears of the young students before they are ready for an experience of, call it seeking God, seeking spiritual consciousness, or endeavoring to live a spiritual way of life. Now watch this very well. Watch this closely. As long as one's thought is centered on the attainment of health or supply or safety or security, the possibility of overcoming fear isn't very great. The reason for the fear must be eliminated before the fear itself can be overcome. In other words, if a person is fearing a condition of their heart, there's no use to tell them to stop fearing for their life. There's no use to tell them to stop fearing for the heart, because that heart has become the symbol of life to them, and everything concerning their hopes and ambitions is tied up in the subject of heart. Now how are they going to stop fearing it? It is in the same way that as long as we look upon money as that which constitutes our supply, there is no use to say to anyone, stop fearing for your supply, because all they have to do is look at the absence of money, and that fear mounts up again. So in the case of one, it must first of all be brought to light that heart is not the source of life before the fear about the heart can be given up. And in the other case, it must be made clear that money does not constitute supply. Money has its part to play, but it does not constitute supply. The heart also has a part to play, but it does not constitute life. Sometimes fear is quickly overcome in the realization that the heart does not give life, that it is life that animates the heart. I'm sure there must be lots of hearts out in the cemeteries, and they're not doing much good to anyone out there, because it isn't the heart that produces life or gives life. It is life that functions the heart. And when attention is removed from the heart to the great truth that it is life itself that governs the heart, then fear is removed from the heart and the things of the heart. And in the same way, when it is realized that supply results in money, that fear can be removed from the subject of money. Money does not constitute supply. I suppose there too it could be said that there must be lots of wealthy people in the cemeteries, but it isn't doing them much good. There are lots of wealthy people in conditions of life where their money is absolutely valueless to them, so that money is not that which constitutes their supply. They may have lots of it and lack many things, but supply does result in a sufficiency of all the money that may be necessary for any purpose. Fear is removed from the subject of what appears at sometimes to be lack, when it is realized that money, like the heart, is a product, an effect, and not a cause. So it is today with these world events. There are undoubtedly thousands of these atomic bombs, nuclear fission bombs, distributed around the world, and they are not doing any harm to anybody. It isn't bombs that do the damage. It is the consciousness of the men and women of the world. And so to keep one's attention focused on these bombs is going to avail nothing. Keep one in bondage to fear and prevent the solution. There are enough men and women engaged in the making of these bombs so that the rest of the world can well afford to think of the state of consciousness of the governing men and women of the world and arrive at a conclusion. Now let us face this first from a human standpoint, because I'm speaking now not to the world. I know in advance that the world has no interest in what I'm about to say. It is only those who have turned to teachings like this that would have any understanding at all of what I'm about to say. From the human standpoint, face this, that the experience that is called death, passing from this phase of existence, is one that is common to every man and woman who has ever been born. and therefore is an experience that will happen to everyone who ever has been or will be born. And if we understand that, we will lose our fear of it. It is as inevitable as birth. And since we do not hesitate, never have in past, to send armies of young men and women out to lose their lives, there should certainly be nothing about death that should frighten those who have gone beyond the age of those youth who are so ready, willing, at every call to go out and sacrifice theirs. So that for us, the matter of living or dying should have no possible weight in our thoughts, nor should it produce any sense of fear. Living or dying isn't the important thing or the question at all. Under circumstances of war, dying has been construed as an honor. In the introducing of every religious teaching in the world, death has played its part to the young and to the old. And that too has been considered an honor. But it should no more be considered an honor than a disgrace. It should no more be considered good under those circumstances than it should be considered evil under other circumstances. In other words, we have no right to be considering the subject of death in connection with our world events. What we should be considering is the change of consciousness necessary to produce a world worth living in. We saw the picture of the Ten Commandments the other night, and I feel really it's worthwhile for everybody on the globe to see it. Everybody must get something from it. But one of the I saw 2 points in the spiritual approach to life, well brought out in that picture, but there was another point I saw that baffled me, one for which I still have no answer. Here were these Hebrews living under Pharaoh in slavery, and a slavery that was probably as bad or could even be worse than they are experiencing in Russia. And there was no hope. They had nothing to look forward to but starvation, malnutrition, hard labor, beatings, punishments, death. And yet those people were multiplying like rabbits. What on earth parents had in mind in bringing more people into this world to live that life that the Hebrews were living under Pharaoh, I can't imagine. I was thinking of the Master's statement, if your hand offend thee, cut it off, your eye offend thee, pluck it out. I don't know why they just didn't pluck out of their consciousness all idea of producing and reproducing in a period of that kind, and yet some force, some instinct within them kept them right in the line of producing and reproducing. And so it is in an age like this, where there has been nothing to look forward to from one generation to another but another war, and each time one worse than before. This age-old urge for reproduction keeps going on. Now, that's just incidental, because I suppose there is no way for men and women to decide that conditions are so bad that they won't have any children. Probably conditions never get that bad. I just happen to think so. But if they, or if the world at large, can go on about its normal business of producing and reproducing under such horrible conditions of life, then surely that itself must make clear that the mere living or dying is not the important point, but the inevitability of achieving the state of consciousness that makes life worth living. And there were those Hebrews living every single minute of their lives in hope of the coming of the one who was to free them. You would think they lived without hope, but they didn't. They lived every single minute in a hope of the deliverer coming, the one who would set them free from those conditions. Well, you know, there's something much more noble about that than the experience of human life today, in which we just seem to be in hopes that somebody will find a way to stop a bomb. That's not a high deliverance, just to be delivered from a bomb or from poverty. Now, I said that humanly we must face the situation of life as we find it today, first of all, by overcoming the fears of the human race, and this means coming to some understanding within ourselves as to what constitutes life. By life, do we merely mean the removal of the danger of a bomb? By life, do we merely mean resting on the fact that at a certain age we'll have Social Security to live on? By life, do we merely mean that business as usual, regardless of what happens to the rest of the world? Or do we mean within ourselves, and I'm speaking now only of those opening themselves to spiritual wisdom, do we mean by life the attainment of a state of consciousness in which we find freedom from the fears of the world? There's no other freedom except the freedom from fears, because when freedom from fear is attained, it is only attained because of the overcoming of the conditions that have produced fear. In other words, once you stop fearing your heart, you begin to enter a higher sense of life, because then you find the change that takes place when you realize that your life is not dependent on your heart, and you begin to live independently of your heart. You begin to live without a thought of heart entering your mind, and you then find that the heart is governed harmoniously by life, and you wonder how it happened. In the same way, the moment a person, whether on the lowest levels of earning capacity or in the highest ranks of business, begin to perceive that money is not the part of life that produces prosperity, but that there is that which guarantees the prosperity even in the realm of money, life begins to take on a different mode of expression. I go back to the Master. Take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, wherewithal you shall be clothed. The nations of this world seek after those things. This in itself tells you of the two different levels of consciousness that exist in the human world, those that he referred to, not politely, as the people of this world. They take thought, but not ye. Ye, the spiritual students of the world, seek ye the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and these things, the wherewithal that you shall be clothed, and the food you eat, and the rent, the housing, and the capital, all of this shall be added unto you. Now, there are two states of consciousness in the human world. The state of consciousness that is called the people of this world, the nations of this world, those who live by effects, and they live mostly in fear, because there's always the danger of something happening to those effects. And then there are these others, ye, he called them, ye. These live by the grace of God and find that all these things that the nations of this world is worrying about, concerning itself about, fearing, hating, loving, these are all added without taking thought, without giving any conscious thought, without fearing, without concern, without doubt, without all of the anxieties and fears that are known to the people of this world. It is a difficult transition for a human being to make. The transition from being of the nations of this world that fear things to the state of consciousness that is called ye, my disciples, those who take thought for the things of God, letting these other things be added unto them. It is not an easy transition to make, because we were born in a materialistic age. We were born in an age when things were important, and spiritual emphasis either of no importance at all or something even to be ridiculed. Now, when students first come to a spiritual teaching with problems of this world, physical, mental, moral, financial, their first thought is that they can combine their old material modes with the spiritual. In other words, it would be a very good idea if you could go on taking these medicines that are given to you and have some prayers at the same time that would in some mysterious way cooperate with the medicines and make you nice and whole. You see, you have had to sacrifice nothing. You've had the comfort of the medicines and the prayers both. And nice arrangement if you can get it. In the same way, every student, and none of us are any exception to this. Remember, I'm not speaking down from a holier-than-thou attitude. I have been there, and so I know how very nice it would be to be able to, yes, I can remember back to the first days when I thought of being a Christian Science practitioner, and I had it all worked out that I was saving $100,000, and I was going to have this $100,000 fund invested in an annuity at 4 7/8% to bring me in my annual income while I would sit in an office and give you a treatment on supply. Oh yes, I was going to combine material aid and the spiritual and make them work as a team. And there isn't a day of the week that we do not receive many, many letters from people whose families are enjoying all the benefits of materia medica and would like some prayers to go along with it. And of course the end should be that between the medicine and the prayers, these people should have their health restored and then look forward to more periods of medicine and more prayers. But you see, the Bible tells us, choose ye this day whom you will serve. And so there isn't one of us who has ever come to this path that hasn't reached a certain day and date, a certain event or experience in life in which a choice had to be made, in which the realization was brought out, I can't go on this way forever. I cannot combine God and mammon. I cannot combine spirit and medicine. I cannot continue a partial reliance in one direction and another partial reliance in another, that I will have to ride one horse in this race of life. That is a difficult day for students, because the status quo is usually very good. A little medicine and a little spirit. A loan here and a little prayer to be able to pay it back. It is really borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And in the end it doesn't work. That is why practitioners in our work only succeed in the degree that they have arrived at a state of consciousness in which they have perceived the reason for our faith. And this is the point that I'm coming to. It isn't that we believe that there is a God who for some mysterious reason is going to heal your disease while not healing the man down the street with the same disease. It is not that we believe that there is a God who is going to do something for our supply that it isn't doing for the supply of our neighbor down the street. It isn't really that we look at life from the standpoint of its physical aspects and believe that there is a spiritual God going to change them. Oh no. You only come to the practitioner's state of consciousness when you have seen through the physical sense of existence to the absolute truth. And then you have what the world calls courage of your convictions. And it isn't that at all. It's a knowledge of principles. In other words, a doctor watching us by the bedside of a dying patient may say, you have a lot of courage not to resort to a material remedy. But I can say to you that there's no courage involved in it at all. It is having attained a state of awareness in which it is evident that health is not dependent on the body, but that body is dependent on an omnipresent state of health. Health is here and now. Health is just as much here as integrity, loyalty, fidelity. And the reason we are not experiencing it in its fullness is that we are not looking to health to govern the body. We are looking to the body to produce health. And that is the reason we are having financial difficulties all over the world, resulting in these fears of bombs. There'd be no fears of bombs if it weren't for dollars and pounds. Don't forget that nobody wants to throw these bombs around except for any reason. Dollars and pounds is the only reason that any nation wants to throw bombs. They either want more dollars and pounds than they've got, or they're trying to protect those that they have, and they're willing to throw these bombs around to do it. Now, you can't ask them out in the world to change that, because they have no way through the human mind. The things of God are foolishness with man, so they have no way of knowing that money isn't supply, and money doesn't produce supply. Supply produces money, and supply is as omnipresent as air. There is as much supply here, right where I am and right where you are, as there is air, and just as available, and it's free. It is not attained by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. The truth shall make you free. Know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And from the moment that you begin to reverse the material sense of life and begin to understand that life functions this body and that supply functions money, you are then free of the fears of this world. You have overcome this world. The Master said, I have overcome this world. And he hadn't overcome it by having the wealth of Midas, nor had he overcome it by having a storehouse full of health. He overcame this world by knowing that right here where I stand is holy ground. For there is a spirit in man that perpetuates him. And the dependence on that spirit to produce harmonious form was his overcoming of the world. If he thought form was the important thing, he could not have been happy at all, because he had not too much, not even enough, we're told, where to lay his head. Of the things of life he had few, but of the joys of life and the harmonies of life he had all. So it is proven in the experience of every student on a spiritual path that the body does not give health, nor does the body control health. It is health that controls the body, and health is a constituted part of our consciousness. All that the Father hath is mine. Therefore, the immortality and eternality of the Father is the immortality and the eternality of my being, and it is that truth known, realized, which becomes the health of the body. So it is. It takes no courage to give up the use of material remedies. The moment one realizes that one's health is not dependent on a form or an effect, it is not difficult to lose one's fear of abundance or lack of abundance when it is realized that it isn't money that constitutes the abundance, but the realization of the abundance that produces the forms of supply. Now, we have a part to play in these world affairs, and while we have no way of knowing at this present moment what effect the part we play will have on the world from its standpoint, we do know the effect that it will have upon ourselves. There again, Scripture says that 1,000 shall fall at your left hand and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come nigh your dwelling place. And of course, until we demonstrate that it will not come nigh our dwelling place, we cannot hope to teach this to the nations of the world. That is why it seems selfish at first, our work, because at this present moment We know that we cannot be the benefits of the world we would like to be, and so we're not trying to be. What we are trying to do is to bring a measure of spiritual demonstration into the households of these 5,000, and then 6 and 10, so that by the fruitage of our experience, enough more of the world will observe to want to investigate. In other words, again, as the Master said, this world will pass away, but not my word. And so it is that we may not be in time to save the world from the catastrophes that it is bringing upon its own shoulders by its own materialistic outlook, but at least the word that is being preached, the word that is being printed, will keep on until he come whose right it is. He will overturn and overturn and overturn until he come whose right it is. And so this word of truth, which has been sounding down the ages now for many centuries, will continue, and it will continue to snowball down the coming centuries until human consciousness has been transformed through this realization. And it is this realization that I'm offering you today for your consideration over these coming weeks. Do not believe that borrowing money and saying a prayer is a good way to demonstrate supply. Do not believe that taking medicine and having a prayer or treatment is a good way to find health. Choose ye this day, and come in meditation, contemplation, to that point where you attain the actual feeling that it is the invisible that is ever present where you are, that is to operate and act upon the visible things of your life, whether your body or your household or your purse. I am come that ye might have life, and that ye might have it more abundantly. You see where this health and harmony and abundance proceeds from I within your being. That word I, which actually you fear oftentimes more than you revere. That very I within your being has its place within you, closer than breathing, for just one purpose, that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly. Again, I'm going back to the picture of the Ten Commandments. Watching it objectively, a question comes to your mind. The question was asked many times during the picture. If your Hebrew God is such a great God and so almighty, why isn't he doing something for the Hebrew people, those who worship him, those who sacrifice themselves because of their refusal to worship the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods? Why, if your God is so powerful, if your God is so almighty, why does he not do something for you in your slavery and your suffering? And that question was asked of these Hebrews by the Egyptians time after time in that picture. And the only answer they could make was, in his good time he will free us. Well, I suppose if you haven't any other answer, that's the most consoling one you can have, is that in his good time. as if there were a God that really would set one free in a certain time and let you suffer all that slaves do suffer meanwhile. Then, when this Moses, who was just as much in the dark as the other Hebrews, just as much puzzled by their plight, just as ready to question God, when that Moses has the illumination and receives the light, from that moment on his life changes, his facial expression changed, his whole bodily appearance changed, and the experience of those around him changed, even to the point of enabling him to liberate the Hebrews from Pharaoh, lead them across the desert and wilderness to some measure of freedom, the degree at least that they could accept. And so the question should be in the mind of everybody in those theaters: why did not God do those things before Moses? Why did God do those things with and through Moses? Why, when Moses wasn't on the scene, did those Hebrews retrograde again into the worshipping of false idols, and the many times that they slipped back into slavery? Why? Why? You have to ask that question. Otherwise you'll be in the same trouble that the Hebrews were in. There will be a spiritual light come into your experience and bring to you some measure of freedom from the evils of this world. But if you're not careful, that one will go on about his father's business, and then you will be back to your false idols and back to your slaveries and back to your troubles until another spiritual light comes along and again gives you a measure of freedom, and then goes on about his father's business while you again go back to the ways of this world. Now the answer to all that is this: until the illumination of Moses, God was absent from the experience of the Hebrews and only became visible and tangible through the enlightened consciousness of one man, Moses. And as long as that light was present among his people, it was sufficient to bring to them a measure, and please remember, it was only a measure of freedom, of supply, of food, of clothing, of housing. Only a measure. At no time during their travels did they attain the standards of living that we know today, or that was known in those days. A measure. The secret lies in this: God is absent from the human scene except where the consciousness of an individual becomes illumined, and then the light, which is God, comes through that transparency. The human mind and the human being is a barrier keeping God out of the world. Therefore, if there be one among you who is enlightened spiritually to the point of perception, where they behold that the invisible is the power, just that one individual, or two or three, can bring about a change in your experience. But the grace of God really only enfolds you when it is you who, like Moses, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jesus, John, Paul, become illumined. When you, as an individual, become illumined, you then are the transparency through which God reaches not only your experience, but the experience of those with whom you come in contact. Again, if you notice that picture, you will see that some of those Hebrews saw so clearly the light that Moses had received that they believed, they had faith, they had understanding, they had vision, and never left his side for a moment through all the trials and tribulations of that Hebrew trek. Whereas the others were more or less fair weather followers. They were happy to follow along and receive the benefits of Moses' illumination, but not seeing the vision, they were equally ready at the first missed meal to turn away from him and go back to Baal. So it is. There are many today following a spiritual way of life to the extent of receiving some measure of benefit from those illumined. And they fall into the two classes. Some apprehend the manner of man or woman of enlightenment and see some measure of their vision, at least to the extent that Peter did when he could say, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And they stick with the teacher through thick and thin and derive not only the benefit of that teacher's consciousness, but some measure of their own. And then there are always those others ready and willing to receive the healings, yet seeing not enough of the vision to enable them to stand in the difficult days. Now, what I'm saying to you is this. One individual, such as Moses or Jesus, receives the light and plays a tremendous part in the history of the world in the bringing of light, illumination, and human betterment to the world. But because more men and women of the world do not receive that, the world retrogrades and goes back again into its material form of slavery, which we have discovered when we were born. And well, it can lose even the vision of today if more do not awaken and become transparencies through which God's grace, God's life, God's supply can reach this world. Well, whenever it's out, you'll have to let it go, because I still have a few minutes in my system. Catch this point. As human beings, we are barriers to God, and God cannot break through. God cannot manifest himself on earth through the human being. It is only the human being receiving light or spiritual illumination that becomes the transparency through which God can appear. And then it is that the grace of God shines through into the particular part of the world where that spiritual light is. There are people today in every part of the globe who have received some measure of spiritual light, and they are a blessing, a benediction to their particular part of the world. It makes no difference whether it is an Hawaiian kahuna who has seen some light, or a Japanese priest, or an English mystic, or German or French. Wherever they are found, they bring a measure of light into their world, just as the spiritual healing practitioners of our modern world bring the light and health and supply to their world. But all the rest of this world, the 99 and 99 100ths%, are in darkness, and they are without the benefit of God operating in their experience.